Good morning. Good morning and welcome to Eurofound's 7th Foundation Forum, which is taking place here today in Dublin Castle, Ireland. As you've heard earlier, the forum is an opportunity for us to debate at the highest level, and the focus of the programme today was to be on Europe's recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Clearly, however, while things changed dramatically in many areas over the last 2 years as a result of this pandemic, this week's shocking events in Ukraine have seen us turn our heads to yet another crisis. The full impact of this new crisis can only be imagined at this stage. But what we do know is that it comes on top of the existing challenges facing Europe and the world after a great recession and a global pandemic. And so today we are extremely grateful to be joined by the first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Gita Gopinath, who has stepped in to represent Madam Georgieva at the last minute at this very difficult time. Gita is the first Deputy Managing Director since January of this year. Before that, she previously served as the Chief Economist at the Fund from 2019 onwards. In that role, she was the Economic Counsellor of the Fund and Director of its Research Department. A very warm welcome to you, Ms. Gopinath. So today we are clearly faced with a new and devastating reality in Europe, which will have long-term implications not just for Europe but for the world. But before the war in Ukraine this past week, we were moving towards some level of recovery, and in the EU at least, the positive effects of measures at national and EU level seemed to have offset the worst of the COVID crisis in many areas. Perhaps could you outline the mega trends that you saw as emerging in the global economy in terms of labour market transformation, and particularly in light of the twin transition of climate and digital change?
Thank you so much for having me join this session. Firstly, I should emphasize, like you rightly did, which is the most pressing issue right now, which is the war that we're seeing in Ukraine. And just to express how deeply saddened I am by the loss of human lives and the economic losses that are now being experienced in Ukraine. We're working very closely with the authorities on a daily basis, and we stand by to provide all the support we can. We're working with other multilateral institutions, including the World Bank, to see how best we can help the people of Ukraine. To your question on the mega trends, the pandemic is a real marker in all of our lifetimes. We had a huge collapse in jobs and in employment in the first year of the pandemic, 2020. And then we have indeed seen a rebound in many parts of the world. So on the positive side, I would say an important feature is we have seen strong recoveries in the job market. Now, it's not uniform, and it's not, if you were to look outside of Europe and especially look around the world, unfortunately, the recoveries are partial. So we do see countries where employment recoveries are much weaker than in the advanced economies that were able to spend a lot in terms of fiscal support and also in terms of monetary policy measures to help their people. In terms of the trends, I would say that one of the trends that precedes the pandemic, but that has been accelerated by it, is with automation. So we've seen this happen in the past. We've seen a steady increase in automation around the world, and we see that getting accelerated in a recession. In this particular pandemic, it's been even more salient because people were not able to be in contact-intensive sectors. So that triggered even more a desire for automation. In the very near term, because of the strong rebound that we're seeing in the labor market, those trends are getting masked. But I would say that over time, we should prepare to see a world where, again, there is continuing automation, accelerated automation, and the need to reallocate workers across sectors. So that's one important trend. The second, which is unique to this pandemic, is the huge loss in learning that has happened around the world, with children being out of school for long periods of time. This is a particularly big issue in developing countries where remote learning is not really an option. And so there's a recent World Bank estimate that finds that, if you look at the loss in terms of learning losses and loss in productivity to students from this pandemic period, that could amount to about $17 trillion over their lifetime. So that's a big hit, which then tells you that in terms of the labor force for the future, this is a very important concern, and it needs to be addressed. So that's the second big trend. The third trend, of course, is we're seeing very different levels of recovery across workers. In some countries, we're seeing young workers, unemployment rates among the young being still very high because they tend to work in contact-intensive sectors. In some other places, we're seeing women still not returning to the labor force as much, partly because they are responsible for childcare and for just care in general at home. So these are some of the broad trends that we are seeing.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, looking specifically, as you say, at the labour market, and we mentioned, and you refer to it again, we've seen some great improvement, certainly across certain countries as we've moved out of the crisis. And certainly some countries are back even to pre-pandemic levels. But do you think that we can actually expect this trend to continue? Or should we in fact be a little bit wary of a false start?
No, I do think we should, we can see the strong recovery as a very positive, durable sign, at least in the absence of any further big shocks to the global economy. I am very concerned about the fallout from the war in Ukraine, not just in Ukraine and in Russia, but for the world as a whole. So that is a shock to keep a close eye on. But in terms of the recovery that we've seen so far, I mean, if you look at the European Union, the unemployment rate is at around 6.4%, which is a record low unemployment rate for the European Union. The labor force participation rate is also at all-time highs. So we've seen very strong recoveries. That hasn't come on its own. That's come because there were good policies that were put in place. Many countries put in labor retention schemes. This took the form of either providing subsidies for wages, but also in the form of short-term work schemes. All of that kept firms and workers matched in Europe, and that helped prevent a larger increase in unemployment. So if you look at the peak of the pandemic in 2020, the increase in unemployment rate was about 0.4 percentage points. And this new research that we are releasing today says that in the absence of the job retention schemes, 4 million additional workers would have become unemployed. So these programs worked, and we're seeing strong recoveries in labor markets. Now, I will point out, though, that there's geographical differences even within Europe. So you have seen faster recoveries in France and Spain and in Ireland, somewhat slower recoveries in other places because they are being hit by different shocks. Some countries, like Germany, are hit more by supply-side shocks. The bottlenecks in manufacturing is a concern. So the recovery is somewhat slower. Places that rely a lot on contact-intensive activities would see somewhat weaker recoveries. But overall, the trend has certainly been on strong recoveries in labor markets and in terms of job vacancies being posted. Now, to your question of durability, again, like I said, we obviously have new developments in the world all the time, and the war in Ukraine is the most salient one right now. That could have an effect on labor markets more generally. It's too early to tell how that will play out, and so I wouldn't want to remark on that. But we have to keep in mind that the labor market, you need to continue to recover. If you look at the hours worked, it's not fully back to pre-pandemic levels, though it's not that far behind. Also, one has to pay attention to what happens when all the policy support from the pandemic gets withdrawn, whether we might see an uptake in increase in unemployment at that point. There is certainly some risk around that. And it's important to reskill and retool workers. It's important to remedy the loss in education, all of these aspects. Now, the Next Generation EU funds can certainly play an important role, and it is being used also for training and reskilling. That could absolutely help with sustaining the recovery.
And maybe just to take up there on your point about the heterogeneous recovery, recently your managing director said something about that the world had been doing the right thing for more than 2 decades, and that there had been convergence. Poorer countries were catching up. But then she referred to the fact that during the pandemic, the increasing risk of divergence within and across countries was occurring, including in the EU. What do you think that we could do to try and embed policies which protect that upward economic convergence, but perhaps not only the economic convergence, but also the social convergence?
Now, this is an issue that we've been shining a lot of light on, because while we are seeing very strong recoveries in some countries, for some people, in some sectors, there are certainly other parts of the world and in other sectors and people for which the recovery is not as strong. So we still have this divergence. We have a lot more scarring in several emerging and developing economies than we have in advanced economies. So this is something that one has to address. And in terms of ensuring that there is continued convergence, if I were to just focus back on Europe in terms of having the continuous convergence, we need to make sure that people are matched with productive jobs. And here I will come back to one of the major trends I mentioned at the beginning, which is with automation. So as we see a further acceleration in automation coming out of this pandemic, we would expect that over the long term, we would see much more sectoral reallocation of jobs. So we would see more jobs coming up in IT sector, in the health sector, and fewer if in the retail sector, right? And so you would need workers to be reallocated. So in fact, when we looked at the number of jobs that would get created over the next decade, pre-pandemic, when we looked at that number, it was about 5 million jobs. Now, because of the pandemic and the shift in automation, we expect that the number of jobs will be about 1.5 million less than that 5 million. So there will be fewer jobs, all else equal, and that would be a concern that needs to be addressed. In terms of what policies are useful for preventing divergence, one is, the job retention schemes have been extremely helpful in keeping workers matched with their jobs. It's given them also, a sense of security, the social safety net that comes with it. And as that is being withdrawn, it should be done, of course, carefully, keeping in mind the developments one is seeing. If there are some sectors that are still required to be shut down, one would pay greater attention, make sure that support is provided over there. The second is that while we need this reallocation of workers to happen, it's important for that reallocation to not involve a worker going through a long spell of unemployment, because we know that whenever that happens, it's just much harder to keep the worker in the workforce. So the idea would be to smooth the transition so that a worker goes between jobs as opposed to going into unemployment for a long period of time and then having to come back into the market. And that can be done, of course, by helping workers find jobs more easily, by helping them with their job search, helping them with the skills that's needed to find new jobs, digital learning so that you can be ready for the jobs of the future. That's another very important policy action that would be needed. And then the last is, to have a sound, good social protection scheme. And we've seen how important that's been in this pandemic. Countries that had good social safety nets were able to maintain the livelihoods of their people. When the economies reopened, activity came back very quickly. So we have good examples, good lessons. We know how to, reach out to people very quickly. This pandemic has taught us all that, even though one had to work remotely. So I think all of those lessons have to be learned, and one has to revisit once this pandemic is behind us about how to build a strong social safety net in many of these countries.
Thank you, Ms. Gopinat, for your time and very valuable insights at this critical moment for Europe and for the world. Thank you for stepping in as first Deputy Managing Director of the Fund, and please again do convey our best wishes to Ms. Georgieva. Your contribution will undoubtedly form the backdrop for the rest of the day's discussions as we try to navigate both the critical, immediate and long-term challenges to moving towards recovery into the future. And to start us off on this journey today, I now hand over to my colleague, Massimiliano Mascarini.